Predicting the weather, that's my song. For 133 years, I've never been wrong. So is it early spring or more winter forecast? Stop the music. Here is my forecast. Faithful followers, there is no shadow of me. A beautiful spring it shall be.
Hi everybody, my name is Shana and this is the American English Podcast. My goal here is to teach you the English spoken in the United States through common expressions, pronunciation tips, and interesting cultural snippets or stories. I hope to keep this fun, useful, and interesting. Let's do it. Hi everybody, hope you're doing well. Things are pretty well here, other than I have a sore throat, so I apologize in advance if my voice sounds a little funny. My family and I decided to spend the month of January in Florida, the idea being that Lucas can kick off his music career in the U.S. by writing with Spanish-speaking songwriters. It's been pretty interesting here so far, other than all of us getting sick, but I'll definitely talk about that a little bit more in a future episode. For today, we'll be talking a little bit about the expression to put someone on a pedestal. We'll do some pronunciation exercises and we'll talk about Groundhog's Day, which is a goofy and very popular tradition in the U.S. and Canada every year on February 2nd. At the event, a groundhog informs the public whether winter will continue or whether spring will come early. It sounds ridiculous, I know. My husband reminds me of that, and he also actually refused to believe me when I told him about this event. But it is part of American culture, and the facts about it are pretty entertaining, so stay tuned for that. We'll begin by jumping straight into the expression, which is to put someone on a pedestal. Let's go through the individual words first, and then I'll give you the definition and some examples. So to put is a verb, and it means to move or to place in a certain position. My grandma put the plates on the shelves in the cabinet, for example. Someone is a pronoun. It's an unspecific person or unspecified person. Someone should help him carry out his groceries. They're heavy. On is a preposition. It means to be physically in contact with and supported by another surface. So there's a book on the table, right? The surface that's underneath is the table, and the book is physically touching it on top. A is an indefinite article or non-specific determiner. I'm in the mood to read a good book. Any book would be fine, right? It could be a biography or a crime novel. Sometimes we pronounce it a, sometimes a. It doesn't matter. Pedestal is the base that supports a statue. So in ancient Greece, there are many statues of gods on top of pedestals. In Hollywood, you might actually run into some statues of famous people on top of pedestals. In any case, whoever is on top of that pedestal, on top of that platform or that structure below, is considered to be an important person, right? At least in that specific area where the statue is. So when we think someone is perfect or without faults or almost godlike in a way, we put them on a pedestal. It simply means that we think so highly of a person that they're better than everyone else, right? They're perfect, they're faultless, there's nothing bad about them. Let me give you some more examples to make more sense of how we would use this expression in conversation. Example number 1. Imagine that your best friend gets a new boyfriend and they start to spend all of their time together. It seems like your best friend has no more time for you. So when you finally manage to catch up, you realize that your best friend only wants to talk about everything that her new boyfriend says and does, right? All the things he likes and pretty much how wonderful he is. You might walk away from that encounter thinking to yourself, wow, she really puts him on a pedestal. In other words, she thinks he's perfect, he's without any faults, and maybe even better than everyone else. Example number 2. Imagine that you're obsessed with technology. You love computers, software, web design, and everything that has to do with the internet. One day, a little late, you learn about Steve Jobs, who, as you probably know, was the pioneer of the first personal computers and co-founder of Apple. You think to yourself, wow, this guy changed the world. You learn that he went to India, so you want to go to India too. He studied Zen Buddhism, so you decide, I want to study Zen Buddhism also. You want to be just like him, You think he's perfect and without any faults. You put him on a pedestal. Example number 3. Sometimes we can actually put ourselves on pedestals as well. This means that we think we're better than others. We put ourselves above them. People who are full of themselves, conceited or arrogant, put themselves on a pedestal regularly. I bet you probably remember the series Game of Thrones. If you haven't seen it, no worries. There is a character in that show named Joffrey. He is in love with himself. He thinks he is the best thing that's ever walked on the face of this planet. And even as a kid, he believes that he's the most deserving person in the world to be king. With this sort of state of mind, he treats everyone else as his inferior. In conversations, he doesn't let others talk. He interrupts them with his own ideas. He blames others for things he has done wrong and then even punishes them for it. He believes he's perfect. He puts himself on a pedestal. So that is it for the examples. Let's go through some pronunciation exercises. Repeat after me. I put him. I put him on a. I put him on a pedestal. I put him on a pedestal. Now let's go through the conjugation. I put myself on a pedestal. You put yourself on a pedestal. She put herself on a pedestal. He put himself on a pedestal. It put itself on a pedestal. We put ourselves on a pedestal. They put themselves on a pedestal. Remember, put is also the same in the past tense as it is in the present tense. And so you actually need a context to know whether the statement, I put myself on a pedestal, is in the present or in the past. There are a few other very short verbs in English, such as cut, hit, and hurt, that kind of follow this same format. So they are the same in the past as they are in the present. Let's go ahead and begin with the fact of the day, which is Groundhog's Day. And first off, let's talk about the groundhog. A groundhog is casually called a woodchuck in American English and scientifically called the Marmota monax. Groundhogs are the biggest member in the squirrel family. Its head and body together can grow up to 24 inches in length, and its tail another 9.75 inches. They can weigh up to 13 pounds. Like squirrels, they are brownish gray in color, and their coat has 2 layers. The bottom layer is fur, and the top layer is made up of grayish-brown coarse hair. The majority of groundhogs in the world can be found in the central or eastern parts of the U.S., Canada, and up in Alaska, which is the U.S.'s largest state. They often live between forests and fields and spend most of their days building very complex tunnel systems underground that we call burrows. In them, in these burrows, they store food, they nest, and hibernate. That's right, groundhogs are true hibernators. They fall asleep in October and wake up in early spring. And for that reason, they need to store up on fat in spring, summer, and fall to help them survive during these cold winter months. In fact, in one day, a groundhog can eat up to 1/3 of its body weight in plants, veggies, flowers, and other types of vegetation. So they're herbivores. They eat plants and veggies. They do not eat meat. They're not omnivores or carnivores. Oftentimes, they eat so much that they can actually destroy perfectly manicured lawns. They might eat their way through healthy vegetable gardens, leaving farmers fuming or very, very angry with a bunch of chewed up tomatoes, carrots, and vegetables left behind. What is Groundhog's Day or Groundhog Day? Groundhog Day is sort of a goofy, popular tradition in the U.S. and Canada on February 2nd every year, when a groundhog emerges from the darkness of its den and informs the public whether spring will come early or whether there will be a long winter. So he is sort of a weather forecaster. He forecasts the weather. In other words, he predicts how the weather will be in the near future. The groundhog acts as an animal meteorologist. The groundhog's forecast really depends on whether it sees its shadow. If it's sunny outside, the forecast is that winter will stick around for another 6 weeks. If it doesn't see its shadow, spring will come early. Even though many people are aware that the groundhog is a bad predictor of the weather, according to Storm Facts data, they confirmed that the groundhog, Punxsutawney Phil, was right only about 39% of the time, which is pretty bad. Many people still enjoy watching the televised event on TV or YouTube, or reading about it in the news after the event takes place. So you might be asking yourself, why in the world does a groundhog predict weather in the first place? Well, since medieval times, various animals have been considered forecasters of weather. According to the Farmer's Almanac, farmers would observe their animals to better prepare for upcoming weather conditions. For example, if a cat sneezed, it meant a sign of rain. If a pig gathered many leaves and straw in the fall, it might be a cold winter. If rabbits were particularly overweight in fall, you could expect a very cold winter. These are just to name a few. Using a groundhog to predict the weather, on the other hand, is actually a modification of a tradition with roots in Germany, where farmers would watch the behavior of badgers as they came out of their burrows on February 2nd. February 2nd is a holiday called Candlemas Day, and on that day, the sun's position falls right between the equinox and solstice. It was believed that 6 weeks from that day, the weather would be exactly opposite as the current weather situation. So German immigrants in the early 1800s brought this tradition to the U.S., where groundhogs were more prevalent, more common than badgers. And so the groundhog was chosen for the first weather forecast, which took place in Morgantown, Pennsylvania on February 2nd, 1840. And since then, there were two really big events in history that made this tradition so popular. Number one, in 1887, the first official Groundhog's Day event took place in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania. Say that 5 times fast. A man named Clymer Freyas had convinced the Groundhog Club, which was essentially a group of businessmen and groundhog hunters, to host it. At the time, this Groundhog Club was also responsible for hosting a big summertime groundhog hunt, followed by a feast that contained many groundhog dishes. Most likely at the first Groundhog Day event itself in February, the groundhog was actually eaten. Today, we don't eat the groundhog. We put him on a pedestal. He even has a name, Punxsutawney Phil. He's deemed as so important, both by the club and by some of his fans, that for the past 134 years, crowds have gathered in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, at what's called Gobbler's Knob, to hear his forecast. In recent years, the city's population grew from about 5,000 to 40,000 on the day of the event. And millions of other Americans watch his forecast on TV and read about it in the news after it occurs. Phil, the groundhog, according to the president of the Groundhog Club, is immortal like the Easter Bunny, Mickey Mouse, or Donald Duck. He commented on Time.com that the club keeps him alive by giving him a secret elixir. Very interesting, huh? Although realistically, there's been about 13 or 14 Phils of these groundhogs because groundhogs only live for up to about 10 years. There was one other big thing that happened that popularized the event. In 1992, a movie was released called Groundhog Day, starring Bill Murray, who played a weatherman that somehow gets stuck in a time loop and is forced to relive Groundhog's Day over and over and over again. The setting of the movie was supposedly in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, and the movie was so popular back then that more people began to follow Punxsutawney Phil. The movie is now considered culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant by the United States National Film Registry. So let's wrap this up. As of 2020, Groundhog's Day has been going on for 134 years, at least in the U.S. In Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, older men, actually a group of just 15 in the inner circle, still conduct the ceremony wearing black top hats, just as they did in the past. At times, they speak in a dialect of German. The majority of the ceremony, though, is in English, and communication with the groundhog is in GROUNDHOG'S, which is apparently the language that specific members of the Groundhog Club speak to communicate with this groundhog. Other than Punxsutawney Phil, there's now a Staten Island Chuck that forecasts from New York. The residents there actually say he's more accurate than Phil. In Canada, there's Wharton Willie, among many others. And in Vermilion, Ohio, which has nothing really to do with the groundhog, there is a woolly bear festival where caterpillars forecast how severe the winter will be. And over 100,000 people attend that event. So there are a lot of different weather predicting animals in the U.S. I'm curious, are there weather predicting animals where you're from? I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to write to me at theamericanenglishpodcast@gmail.com. I'd encourage you to watch a few videos of the event online. The event is quirky. Once again, it's random. You probably won't get any good idea about what the weather will be like, but at least you'll get to understand a little bit more about this tradition that has stuck around for over a century. To end today's episode, I'd like to give you a tongue twister, and it is, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? In other words, how much wood would a groundhog be able to throw if a groundhog were able to throw wood? So once again, that is, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? And there is a response to this. This is a very common tongue twister in English. A woodchuck would chuck as much wood as a woodchuck could chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood. Once again, a woodchuck would chuck as much wood as a woodchuck could chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood. All right, so play around with that, pause, rewind, and practice as much as possible. Other than that, hope you're enjoying your week and talk to you soon. Bye.